So we're going to read a little bit of Rudolf Steiner's A Philosophy of Freedom together. Steiner was a German philosopher, teacher, uh, and what to call him, a clairvoyant, a seer, someone who claims to have knowledge of um, spiritual realities, of to have access to domains of experience beyond the physical. And uh, it's our common sense nowadays to believe that thinking, consciousness, is something which takes place inside the skull, that it's basically a neurochemical process that either emerges as a result of the complex activity of neurons or that can be eliminated as an artifact residue of language that ultimately some materialist philosophers today like the Churchlands or Daniel Dennett would say that there is no such thing as consciousness. It doesn't even emerge as a result of complexity, neural complexity. It's really just a word that we use for something that is material and mechanical and can be explained in terms of particles and forces, at least fields of force. It can be explained in terms of physics. Now, for Steiner, thinking is, in terms of the evolution of human consciousness over the course of prehistory and history, Steiner would agree that at this particular moment, thinking is more brain-based than it ever has been before, more bound to what we call the sensory realm, the physical realm, than it ever has been before. He would say that archaic peoples, primal peoples, tribal type of cultures, they had a consciousness that was more um, embedded within the natural surroundings that they called home, that they had a sort of instinctual um, ability to tap into the deeper patterns at work, and that they understood the seasons, for example, without having to write it down in a calendar. They directly perceive the rhythms of the stars and planets, and the wobble of the sun where it rises and sets based on the wobble of the Earth's rotation. They didn't have concepts for these facts, but they immediately experienced their meaning in a way that we today, with our more abstract, distant, alienated consciousness, um, no longer are capable of it. We now have to, because of our self-consciousness, we have to think about our relationship to the world. And to understand the meaning of the motions of the planets, we use calculus, mathematics. Um, we can't hear the songs of the spheres in the way the ancients could. That's no longer meaningful to us because we've lost participation in that domain of the real. Um, However, Steiner wouldn't say that this, um, because of this character of our culture, of the zeitgeist at this time, um, where thinking has been limited to the brain and to the senses, that it therefore must necessarily be so. Steiner thinks there's a way to break through the knowledge that the sense-bound intellect provides for us, or to break through the limit that, let's say, Kantian philosophy um, created. And for Kant, we can't really have access to things themselves. We can't know the world, nature, the universe, or ourselves. Um, Instead, we can only sort of grasp certain concepts that we bring with us to our experiences. We can't know what's behind those concepts and those experiences. Steiner wants to, in writing this book, provide a path for us to follow him through this threshold, beyond this threshold that Kant placed to show that we can actually know ourselves and we can actually know the nature of the world, that we have uh, access to the thing in itself. Though access is probably the wrong word, because for Steiner, to think intuitively, to think as one with the product of one's thoughts or the percepts that one is thinking about, is not to gain access, but to realize one's unity with what before one had supposed was separate. So it's not so much gaining access as it is realizing you're always already unified um, relationship with what you thought you didn't already know. So I'm going to start with, this is a translation by Michael Lipson. I'm going to start with his translator's introduction. Um, I think that's important. And then we'll move on to the book. Lipson writes, "The real heartbreak of translation does not come from the distance between German and English, but from the gap between spiritual and word-bound consciousness. It was Steiner's lifelong sacrifice to engage in this translation, the constriction of spirit into speech. Whether the language he had to use was philosophical, theosophical, or any other, he remained painfully aware of the impossibility of his task. In each year of his life after 1900, Steiner continued to recommend this book, formerly called The Philosophy of Freedom. This translation is called Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. He insisted that his later occult communications presupposed, as a first step to understanding them, the radical change in thinking and thinking consciousness for which this book can serve as a partial training manual. A transformation of consciousness appropriate to our age begins with the intensification of thinking as we know it in ordinary mental life. It moves beyond, but never denies, the achievements of Western philosophy. Yet Steiner was capable of calling the book a stammering, not in false modesty, but to acknowledge that what we say about higher kinds of cognition is inevitably partial and easily susceptible to distortion. A book like Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path can incite or goad us into inner practices, but it does not even attempt to deliver a fixed content for us to possess. Further, as Steiner emphasized in one lecture, quote, "I surely know that this philosophy of freedom bears all the pockmarks of the children's diseases that afflicted the life of thinking as it developed in the course of the 19th century." He said that 20 years after its publication. It therefore has both intrinsic and cultural historical grounds for a certain incompleteness. It is an incompleteness we, the readers, are called upon to remedy. For Steiner's approach to the problem of spiritual expression was in a supremely tactical way. Instead of establishing a fixed terminology to give his meaning a specious uniformity, he took the opposite course. Without fanfare, he used ordinary words, like thinking, feeling, and willing, to denote processes of cosmic proportions. Without indicating his shifts, he used such words now in the humblest, now in the most exalted sense. And he was content to use several different words, at different times, to express similar meanings. The cumulative effect of these maneuvers is to encourage the reader to develop an especially active style of reading. How does he mean this? Is a question we should often find ourselves asking. At the end of chapter 7, Steiner gives explicit prominence to the question of vocabulary and puts us on notice that he will use language with a rare sense of a license. He thus anticipates the constructivists and hermeneutes of our own day by setting the responsibility for the effects of the book on us, his readers. The current translation attempts to make the text as contemporary in sound and style as possible while preserving accuracy. This effort owes much to the editorial assistance of Christopher Bamford and Andrew Cooper, as well as an enormous debt to all previous translations, especially that of Michael Wilson. Many happy formulations have been simply lifted from that book because I could not match, much less improve them. Interested readers should also refer to Wilson's helpful notes on some of the words that present difficulties of translation and interpretation. Among these are Geist, here most often rendered as spirit, Vorstellung or Vorstellen, here most often mental picture or mental picturing, Erkennen, here cognition or cognizing, Wollen, wishing or wanting or willing, Begriff, concept, and Vornehum, Vornemun, 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 percept. These especially thorny words, like others, are given variously in English depending on the meaning they take in each passage. Of course, only cognizing for Erkenen represents a real break with previous translations. I use cognition and cognizing, despite their Latinate, alienated quality, because they convey the mind's active grasp of specific meanings in a way that knowledge or knowing do not. The act of cognizing, rather than the relatively passive knowing, fits better to a text Steiner originally hoped would bear the English title, The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity. By suggesting an alternate title in English, Steiner again proved himself flexible regarding terminology. We have taken this as permission to retranslate the title, and we have called it, this time, Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, a Philosophy of Freedom. The new title emphasizes the unique focus of Steiner's work, among all the spiritual movements of our time, on the development of thinking consciousness into something altogether different from its manifestation in ordinary mental life. The thinking appropriate to an understanding of the perceptual world necessarily includes a development in how we perceive, and so we could also have used some such title as Intuitive Thinking and Perceiving as a Spiritual Path, if it were not both awkward and hard to understand. It is clear from Steiner's emphasis on the two directions from which experience comes to meet us that both thinking and perceiving are susceptible of infinite exercise and development. Despite terminological fluidity, Steiner was exact in his use of the words wahr, true, and wirklich, real. Truth, as a feeling, applies to our sense of the world of thinking. The real, as a feeling, applies to our sense of the world of perception. Cognition of the kind Steiner points to in this book brings us to a new world of true reality that involves both the evidentiary clarity of thought, truth, and perception, the real. I have therefore tried to translate these terms consistently, even when it does some violence to English usage, to underscore the precise duality Steiner indicates and overcomes. I have also tried to preserve Steiner's implicature. He had many ways of hinting, rather than declaring, subtly alerting us to knowable if elusive sources of the known world. One technique was his frequent use of the outmoded that which construction, as in that which we can form mental pictures about. I have resisted the linguistic pressure to collapse such constructions and dry out their suggestiveness. They bear a lineal and substantive relation to the great that which of John 1, chapter 1, verse 1. Quote, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled, of the word of life. End quote. We should recall that Steiner's goal was to stimulate the exercise of a thinking independent not only from words, but from the physical body and the brain. In keeping with this goal, we are well justified in retranslating intuitive thinking as a spiritual path into English from time to time, both to reflect evolving understandings of the book and to liberate ourselves from a nominalistic equation of words with concepts. In this way, we have an advantage over German language readers, who are tempted to imagine their version of the text as final, By approaching Steiner through inadequate and changing English terms, we are more likely to face the inadequacy of all terms and leap to his meaning. So that's the translator's introduction, and I'll post a part 2 where I start reading chapter 1. Actually, I'll read Steiner's preface, and then I'll get into chapter 1 in the next video.